Okay. Welcome everyone to our third community engagement session regarding school start times. I know we have people walking in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. My name's Todd Lambert. I am the Assistant Superintendent of Elementary Schools for Poudre School District. I'm going to be your MC tonight, so I want to tell you a little bit about how we're going to run the evening. We'll have some opening comments, and then Mr. Scott Nielsen, who is here tonight, is going to give a presentation. That takes about 15 to 20 minutes. When that's over, that'll be the opportunity for audience participation. And there's a couple things that we'll do here. The primary way to ask questions is to write them down on the index card that you received when you came in. And I got to tell you, I'm not getting any younger. My eyes aren't getting any better. So when you write those questions, legible, big print, that's really good for me. That helps. A couple of ground rules on that. If it's a comment, tell us it's a comment. Just put comment on there if you want to put it in quotation marks. I'll scan through that and I'll read that out to the audience. There are times people just simply want to say something for everyone to hear. If it's a question, we'll figure that out. I would ask if you do write a question, keep that nice and succinct, nice and clear. I know a couple of times you kind of mix in there what you want to say, then what you want to ask. If it's something you want to say, let's turn that to a comment. If it's a question, we'll do that. That'll be the easiest way. I won't hand the microphone out. It goes a lot faster, and we can get a lot more of your questions answered if we do it off the index cards. That'll be a nice way to take care of that. We have some people in the audience. We want you are actually sitting here down in the front row. We want you to know who they are because they're going to play a role tonight. We have Matt Bryant, who is our Director of Transportation. We have Mr. Dave Montoya, who's our Executive Director of Finance. We have Dr. Sandra Smizer, who is the Superintendent of Schools, and we have Vicki Thompson sitting to her right. He's our Executive Director of Human Resources. We also have a few other personnel here in the night, and we'll introduce them, but I am going to turn it over to Dr. Smizer real quick for some opening comments. She'll give that mic back to me, and we'll get Scott going on this.
Thank you. First, let me introduce, we have a couple board members here. We have Kathy Kipp and Rob Pedersen and anyone else. And I do know that other board members are watching this because it's also available online, and so they are particularly interested in the community comment and question section. So, oh, there's Susan Katowski just arrived as well. So thank you for coming. We've heard some people maybe a bit dubious about whether we're really interested in what you have to say or whether we've already made up our mind. We're going to be very honest with you about the options that we're looking at and what we're hearing from the community tonight, and we really are listening. I can tell you that we've heard some things that we didn't expect to hear, either pro or con, and that we have heard your concerns a little differently than perhaps we thought they were. The survey, remember, is still open online, and we have, where's Lauren? It's some amazing amount. It's like 11,000 responses or something. So we really are reading them all and analyzing what people are saying. So a lot of people have waited until after these sessions to hear this and then go back and fill out the survey. So if you haven't done the survey, also do that for us. And this will be a lengthy process. We hope to have the decision made first, whether we're going to move start times or not, and if we do, how, by December, if we have a lot of time to prepare for the next school year. At the very latest, we're thinking January for the decision to be made. So thank you very much for coming. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks a lot. Just a couple of quick reminders. We do have a team that's working to put this on tonight. Our Channel 10 team, Phil Primo's on the board right up there. He's making sure all this works. He also has Mrs. Deb Hooker, who's right back up here. She's going to be going around and handing out the cards. Also, you'll notice we have some of our fossil students manning some of the equipment. That's really great that they can be part of that production team. And we also want to say a thank you to Dr. Julie Chaplin. I see her back up there. And Mr. Scott Torvik, the Fossil Ridge Administration. We really appreciate all your support. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Scott Nielsen, Assistant Superintendent of Secondary Schools. Scott has a presentation that'll guide us into our question and answer session. When he gets done, we'll come back together and we'll start answering your questions and listening to your comments. Thanks. Scott?
Good evening. As Dr. Smizer and Dr. Lambert said, thanks for coming out. We appreciate your feedback. We've appreciated this now, this being our third time. We look forward to hearing, answering questions, and just learning what the thinking is out in the community. So thanks again for being here. I'll start tonight by saying, maybe I will. About a year ago, administration was charged with studying the option of moving start times to accommodate what research was saying is better for particularly high school students, but the secondary students in general, and their sleep patterns, and some of the benefits that research is showing that can come from a later start time. So for the last year, we've been digging in as administration. As you can see up on the slide, research, we cite the AMA study a lot because it's one of the ones we saw early on that cites this 8:30 or later start time as an important kind of trunk time during the morning for high school students to start, particularly not any earlier than the 8:30 time slot. Our current start times for high school, as many parents here know and certainly students here know, between 7:25 and 8:15 for secondary schools, although I would say this with a caveat, Kennard Middle School is at 8:15. The rest of our high schools and middle schools are between about 7:30 and 7:45. So we have a high number of our students that are between 7:30 and 7:45. We also want to recognize and have along the way with any group we've talked to that in making a decision like this creates challenges. I also like to say in leadership, with challenges are opportunities. So, but it certainly has an impact as you move anything such as start times, has an impact on the community. And I think I said last week, sometimes the impact is positive and sometimes negative. And then that's some of the information we've been gathering as we've gone through this, is you start to see what some of that may be. We started with a survey. Many of you may have taken the survey. It came out in about February. We had a high turnout or participation rate. About 17% of those we surveyed responded. That's about 3 times higher than most of the surveys we give out as a district. We also were struck by about 85% of the respondents were positive toward making some move for high school students. We also saw, as we did this survey across the system, elementary, middle, and high, that everyone believed starting between 8 and 8:30 was the best time. And unfortunately for us, that's too narrow of a window, but that was ideal, and that was across all 3 grade levels. The graph looked almost identical for all 3 grade levels. One of the things that came out in the first survey was that end times were a consideration, something high school families, students were concerned about, and that maintaining time, these two probably correlate with each other, these 2 bullets, maintaining time to do homework and the extracurricular activities, those things all play heavily on the high school student and the high school families. They think about how do we get all that stuff done if in fact we move the end time later in the day. We also found that there was communication about work schedules and how that is impacted, logistics of what do we do if one of the scenarios moves elementary times earlier, how does that impact childcare, how would that work, could we still offer childcare but in a different setup than we do currently, that we should definitely take into consideration our staff as we think about what we're doing with start times. The cost was a big one we heard often in the initial survey was what's the cost, and do we have money in the district to take on or incur cost as we make a decision. We also heard from a huge number of respondents in that first survey to be research-based as we do this, to not move in a half-cocked way, but to make sure that we're looking at and trying to do what is supported by research and in some cases other districts that have moved ahead of us. So we've attempted to do that as we move forward. As we moved through the spring, we did the first survey as a staff. We took a look at the information, and then we pulled together a committee. The committee had representatives from all 4 feeder areas. We had educators from the buildings, we had administrators, we had district administration, and we also had parents and community members as part of that committee. It was an interesting group because we had lots of different perspectives. but it worked out pretty well. We met through the month of May and into June, and our task was to consider and look at the feedback from that first survey and what was that telling us, what direction might that guide us, what were some of the parameters that that first survey laid out for us, and ultimately to use the information to help us drive forward 4 scenarios that we could take out for community feedback and gather more input through the second survey that's currently open, and hopefully have a good bucket of information we can take back to the board as we go through this process. So one of the things that we spent quite a bit of time talking about, when you talk about late start, lots of times what you'll hear is we can't do it. In fact, as a principal, I heard it 2 different times we studied it. We can't do it because transportation won't let you. Matt has been fantastic through this whole process, and what he'll say is transportation can do just about anything, but there's a cost to everything. And you can't, if you put it all between that 8 and 8:30, we end up having to run a huge number of buses more than we run now, because you'd have to run individual buses to every school because they're all starting at the same time. You see there, we run already 600 runs, about 128 different routes, which means we have 128 buses. We run on a 3-tiered system, and you'll kind of see that as we lay out the timing later. We've got this 3-tiered system, and the reason transportation went to that a number of about 10 years ago was it created efficiencies in the system, which helped us have more money to put in the classroom, which is what we're all about. So as we move through the process, you'll see this more, but each bus that we lay out for a scenario, each bus when we buy it costs $100,000, and each bus that we buy, we then have to run, so we have to hire a driver, pay gas, that stuff for it, about $37,000 a year. So you'll see that later. Each scenario, we try to predict how many buses would we need, and obviously the drivers. And so you'll see a first-year cost and then an ongoing cost that goes with each of the scenarios that we present. So I already talked a little bit about the tiered systems and being more efficient. One of the things that we, not just PSD, but lots of front-range school districts right now are wrestling with is hiring and retaining bus drivers. As you may see right now, it's a tough job market. And so pulling people in that want to drive for a few hours in the morning, a few hours in the afternoon, have some time off in between, and want to drive 60 students around can be hard to do and hard to retain. And so Matt and his group they're constantly going through this process of hiring, training, having drivers, and then you have drivers that leave to go do other things. Sometimes it's they found something that is paying them a little better. Maybe it's that's giving them a few more work hours, or maybe they're just saying driving school buses is not for me long term. But that's an ongoing challenge for us in the district. And so we continue to do that. I think what's important to know is that everyone in transportation, all the managers, all those who are doing routing, they all have their CDL license, and they're all driving often to replace openings that they may have in drivers that have either stepped away or out sick, whatever the case may be. And I say that to say, as we as a committee work through scenarios, it was in the forefront of our thinking that if we wanted to add 25 buses, not only is there an upfront cost, but there's the ongoing support and maintaining the bus drivers to drive it, and the committee felt like that was a real challenge. So that continued to come back to us as we looked and said, that's probably not a sustainable practice for us. So tonight I'll walk through 4 different scenarios that we've brought forward. If you've looked at the survey or you had a chance to take the survey, you may already have walked through the scenarios, but we'll walk through those in a little more detail tonight. The first scenario is our current start time. Nothing changes, and so you have a pretty good sense of what that is. We'll break that one down in a little more detail in the next slide. We also brought forward scenario A, B, and C. Our first scenario moves the high school start time to 8:30 and keeps most of the middle and elementaries exactly the same as they are today. The middle school, the only middle school exception is CLP Middle, which is because of where they bring their students in from, they're connected to Poudre High School. So wherever Poudre High School lands, CLP Middle will as well. Scenario B moves the start time for high schools to 8:55, to between 8:55 and 9 o'clock. Moves our middle school start time back to about 8:05. So it moves most of our middles back about 20 minutes. And moves our elementary start times to between 7:45 and 8:50. Our scenario C has a high school start time about 5 minutes later than B, so between 9 and 9:05. Has a middle school start time of 8:35, and elementary start times, we close that gap a little between 7:45 and 8:40. So we looked at multiple start times. Again, one of the things we felt like we were driven by was research, and so that 8:30 time played large as we were thinking about what are we doing for high school start times, because the recommendations are no earlier than 8:30, so that's what we tried to bring forward were start times for our high schools that were at 8:30. In the current start time, obviously we don't meet that. We're not meeting that AMA. We maintain the system as it is with little impact on anything else. And in that scenario, you heard me talk earlier about buses are $100,000. When we look at our growth right now, we anticipate that we'll need 3 extra buses next year. And so our first year cost, or next year's cost, would be about $411,000. $300,000 for the buses and $111,000 for those to run those 3 buses. And you'll see that amount is wrapped into all the other scenarios, because no matter what we do, we believe we'll have growth, and so you'll see that is represented in the other scenarios as well. So let's talk the scenarios that start to move us around a little bit. Scenario A, you heard me talk about as an 8:30 start time. It allows for limited to no change in elementaries and middle. In this case, we start the high schools about an hour later than they do today, and we get high schools aligned to what research says is the best time to start. We're right at 8:30. Middle school start times, with the exception of CLP, would stay unchanged, and they would not be aligned to the AMA. So they would still be about 45 minutes earlier than research would say is best practice for some subset of the middle school. Middle school was interesting because they have not all transitioned to where their brain is going to bed later and wanting to get up later. That happens as you move through, and just like everything else for school-age students, really for humans, we go through them at different rates. Our high school end time in this scenario shifts to about 4 o'clock. And obviously, we recognize if that's the case, it does impact some of what goes on after school. It changes the ability to start your practices at 3:30 or 3:15. You're having to move that back about an hour to pull that off. In this scenario, we estimate about 6 drivers and 6 buses. So your cost is about $820,000 in year 1 and about $220,000 annually to run those buses. So that's the transportation cost of scenario A. We go to scenario B. This is one of the scenarios that we would say is a flip model, and what I mean by that is we're taking the high schools that right now are kind of in line first, our middle are second, and our elementaries most of them tend to be after our middle schools. This is a flip model. Has our high schools starting about an hour and a half later than they start today. Has our middle school start time shifted to 8:05. So it aligns our high schools outside or past the 8:30 start time. Moves our middle schools closer to that AMA recommendation, but doesn't align the practices with the 8:30 start time. As I said, it flips the elementary. In this scenario, we have 10 elementary schools that start at 7:45. Currently, we have 1 that starts at 7:45. Our high school end times would shift to about 4:25, although we think there's a little bit of play in that to potentially pull it forward. This may, as I said before, impact what's going on after school. We move it a little bit later in the afternoon. In this scenario, We believe it's 5 drivers and 5 ongoing for a little under $700,000 in year 1 and about $185,000 ongoing cost for the transportation. And obviously, as each slide will say, that's looking at next year and next year's growth. Each year after that, there's our own independent growth that comes along with that scenario. Move to scenario C. This one has our high schools, again, about an hour and a half. It moved them back about 5 minutes from the previous scenario. But this one aligns our middle schools. It has our middle schools starting at 8:35. So it has our high schools and our middle schools aligned to that after 8:30 start time. It again flips the elementary school, but in this case we have 9 elementary schools that start at 7:45. Our high school end time in this scenario shifts about 10 minutes later to 4:30. And in this scenario, we believe it'll be about $1.1 million in year 1, with an ongoing cost of about $300,000 to run the buses we purchase. And that's what the ongoing cost would be in scenario C. So as we went through the process as a committee, we looked at lots and lots of scenarios. And we had scenarios that had the schools bunched closer together. We had an 8:15 high school start time. Again, that one you see almost a $3 million price tag on it for our year 1 cost. And remember, it's about 20% for ongoing, so it would have been another $1 million or a little under $1 million annually to continue to run those. We ran one that had 7:35 elementary start time, and I will say we had lots of perspectives on the committee. One of the things we wrestled with for a long time was what's too early for elementary start times. And what we landed on was 7:35 was too early. 7:45 we felt like made sense, and largely because we have an elementary school today that starts at 7:45. So if we have elementary students today, the committee felt like it would be hard to say we couldn't have any other elementary school students to do, because our students doing it today are successful with a 7:45 start time. We also ran one that was the 8:45 high school start time, with middle school starting 15 minutes later and elementary between 8 and 9. Again, the cost of that was over $2 million to pull it off. And then you have the ongoing cost that is correlated to that. So in each of those, particularly the top and the bottom, we felt like, one, it was a high price tag, but we also felt like one of the pieces that the committee kept coming back to was how much pressure are we applying to the system by having that many drivers that we'd be adding. You're talking 28 or 20, it was about 20 buses in the top one, wasn't it, Matt? So 20 buses, which means we're looking at 20 new drivers in year 1, but then adding on, and the one down below was a little bit less than 20, but still the committee felt like an awful lot of drivers, not to mention the startup cost and the ongoing cost to make those buses available and able to move. So next steps, so we have the survey out. The survey will be out the rest of the month of September. It's been open since the end of August. As you heard Dr. Smyser talk about earlier, we have about 11,000 respondents to date, and we're hoping we get quite a few more. So if you haven't had a chance, we hope as you leave here tonight, you'll be able to go and give us your feedback. Obviously, we're in the middle of community engagement. Tonight's night 3 of 4. Next week will be our last community engagement session. It will be at Rocky Mountain High School. A half hour later than tonight, we start at 6 o'clock, and it goes 6 to 7:30 at Rocky Mountain High School. Our plan is to take all the survey, look at the information, pull it together, and then share the information with the board in November. I will take it to the board in December, hoping they make a decision. We've worked with the board. They're ready. They want the information as soon as we can get it to them. And they'll make a decision hopefully in December or January. For us, the earlier the better. The more time, if in fact we make a decision, the more time we have, the better we can carry out the plan. So that's our next steps. That concludes my part of the presentation. I think now we'll we'll begin the fun part, as Todd talked about, the audience participation part.
And we'd also like to invite our panel group to come on up to the stage. We've also been joined by Pete Hall, our Executive Director of Operations. Came in a little late. He's been out dealing with operations. That's what he does. All right? He's a big job. Again, just a couple of reminders. There's two things we're going to ask you to do. One, you can make a direct comment. That's great. Reminder just to write comment on the card, so I know that's what you're doing. If you're going to write a question, try to be succinct and write directly at the question so we can sort through those. I'll go through. If there are several with the same theme, I'll try to consolidate a little bit and sort through those, and I'll also try to direct those questions to the appropriate gentleman up here. And I know Deb is going around and getting those cards. We appreciate it. Also, just want to introduce a lot of this work, the survey, the work you don't see that takes place to make an enterprise of this large go off. Lauren Hooten, who's standing right here handing me cards. Lauren, thanks for all that you do with this as well. I'm just going to take a second and sort through and get started here. Hey, Scott, how about an easy one to start off with? You ready? And again, we'll go through here. Comments, questions, Deb will come around and pick those up. And another thing, too, as we go through, maybe a comment somebody makes will be a catalyst for a question you have and you discover, well, we're fine. We'll keep them coming through as we move along. Scott, this is going to be a question for you. We know our high schools have a late start on Wednesday mornings. Are they going to keep that late start?
Well, the answer is we have not made a formal decision on whether we would, but if you're starting depending on which decision is made, if there's a change, and it's a 9 o'clock start time, that's as late as you're starting now, so I guess you could make the argument you'd have a late start every day. If it's an 8:30 start time, I think we'd have to determine how that fits with what everyone else is doing, and if it's a current, we'd like to keep it the same as it is now.
Thanks a lot. I want to read a couple of comments here, too, just to let you know, again, we can write questions and comments. The first one has to do with athletes. Most of our students do club sports. According to the NCAA, 95% of soccer players are recruited from clubs, not high school. Basketball players, large percentages of these. Club sports, and they talk about 92% of basketball players, 91% of volleyball, swimmers, baseball and softball, large percentages recruited off those clubs, not so much the high school team. Club sports are many kids' ticket to college, and late release may cause them to have to quit. I don't know if that's just a comment that's out there, and it brings in some of the questions we have of athletics. One of the questions right off the top was, we have students now who potentially could be coming out a little bit later, missing class time, and so there's some concern about their ability to make that work up, get credit for that work. Can you comment on that, please?
I certainly can. I think it is there's a worry whenever you do that, whether it's at middle school or high school. You don't want your students out of class any more than they have to be, and we obviously have athletes right now who are missing class time to participate in athletics. There's a couple things I think that you can do to mitigate if in fact a change is made. We've seen other districts who have, particularly when you start talking about your competitions, your practice time you control, your opportunity to compete. We would certainly try to work on what control we have of timing, and other districts that have made the change have seen some success in working with their competitors to change the start time of competitions, and others have found it hard to work with their competitors. I will say you're seeing a few large districts in the Front Range who are making the change, and if that trend continues, it will be easier to have those conversations because they're going to be wanting to do the same thing that we would want to if in fact we go down that direction. But there's no question that there's a possibility, if the timing of the event is the same as it is now and our start time or end time moves back an hour, you could assume that students would miss a little bit more time than they are currently.
Some of the research that was up there from the AMA spoke directly to adolescents, our high school students right there at that time. And the question is, are you aware of any research on start times or performance health for elementary students? I think I'll take that question. Would that be all right, since I have the elementary? Again, the question was, we see a lot of research for high school students. Do we have anything elementary? We don't at the level we have for the AMA work on our high school students, but what we have done is, as we've communicated with other districts that are looking into this work, particularly Cherry Creek, Thompson, and some of those, we've got some early indicators that our elementary students are fine at that time. We've also talked in the system. We have Istone Elementary is a 7:45 start up in Wellington. Talked with them. We actually had a representative from the Istone staff on our school start time committee. Got a lot of input from her each time along the way, if you remember. And again, we really feel like that 7:45 is going to go there. But to directly answer that question, not as much research there. It's something we're real interested in, and it's one of the key questions and part of the dialogue we have with our districts that are also doing this work.
Can I add to that, Todd?
Absolutely.
I think one of the things you see, and it really has changed, I know in this district, I've been in the district a long time, we've studied this idea of starting school later at least 2 other times in the 20-some years I've been in town. But what's happened is we medically find out more and more all the time, and one of the things we see with that adolescent brain is that the melatonin is releasing about an hour to 2 hours later in our high school age students. And so that's one of the things that's driving the research, looking at what's happening, that we end up with, because of that, lots of our late middle school and high school students who end up going to bed late. As a principal, I had lots of conversations with parents frustrated with that transition and feeling like it wasn't great and there was this tug of war, when in reality it's what's going on developmentally for that age student. And so I think that's important to think about. Why is there so much research being done on this high school start time? And some of it is that. It's still a huge percentage of school districts across the country have your high school students starting first, earliest in the morning, and your elementary students starting the latest. And that's still the traditional way it's done. And there seems to be this wave of districts looking at and trying to do what makes sense. One of the things you see, if you dig into some of the research that's on our website, you see that the research that's been done talks about things like less car accidents, students that are getting more than 8 hours of sleep at night, the social emotional impacts on high school students are positive. They're more ready to tackle what's going to be in front of them when they get to high school, when they have a full night's sleep. You see it manifests itself through better attendance and better grades and better test scores, better college entrance exams. So the districts that are going there, those are the things they're starting to say they're seeing. Not all of them are collecting that, but the research we're seeing from the medical associations, those are the things they're touting and saying that they're seeing as they look at why something like this might make sense.
That sounds good. How about, Pete, this would be one for you. Schools are going to be getting out later. Will air conditioning be installed in all the schools? And then they added a little comment behind that and said it's hot. Because it is, yes.
At this point, as you all know, we're not fully air conditioned in Poudre School District. Our last 2010 bond took in a lot of new designs for helping to cool the buildings, but not fully implementing air conditioning. So I think it's a great question as we get later in the day, what do the temperatures look like? And at this point, every year is different, as this year was. I do know that we're taking a look at time of day with the city utility rates right now, because they're going to be implementing that at the start of October. And what that might mean to us, the thought behind that is time of day use. As homeowners say, you use less heavier appliances during that point in time when you come home during the day, air conditioning, dryers, things like that. If we go later in the day, I think it's a great question, because we'll probably be running what systems we have later in the day, but we can't offset them with less use during the earlier part of the day, because we still have to run the building. So I think it's a good point, and at this time, the district is not engaging in fully air conditioning in their buildings.
Thanks. I have one of the comments on the card is just a reminder. The question had to do with the online survey. Sounds like the options are A, B, and C. Why is the current time not on the online survey? Just a reminder, we don't associate a letter with that, but that is one of the options is our current time. If we flip back through those screens and those slides, it'll be up there. We'll have A, B, and C are different, but actually the current situation or the current starting times for all of our schools is one of your options. Scott, I'm going to give you this one. There's a question about homework. The amount of homework is increasing. Studies show less homework is actually better for kids. Has the district considered its homework policies in lieu of late start times, and wouldn't this achieve the same thing, more sleep?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. And I can say, as a district, in the time I've been in the district, we've not talked about a homework policy. We don't have a homework policy as a district policy. Certainly something, as I was a middle school principal, we talked about often. And if you go back to what I talked about before, that part of the challenge that we have is not that students aren't going to bed because they have stuff to do and they don't want to go to bed. In many cases, it's because they're not as ready to go to bed at 9 or 10 o'clock when they move through that process where their body clock shifts back an hour or two. And so it may be that they have less homework and they still stay up till the same time. I will tell you that one of the districts that we have had a chance to watch is Cherry Creek. And Cherry Creek they're in their second year this year, a district a little bigger than us. And they are engaged in a study with one of the hospitals down in Denver. And what they saw in year one was interesting to me as a secondary person, that they saw their high school, and let me cite it so I get it right, they saw the bedtime for their high school students moved back 13 minutes. One of the things we heard in the first survey was, if you move the start times back, they're just going to move bedtimes back the equal amount. Well, Cherry Creek saw that their high school students moved their bedtime back 13 minutes, and they slept 61 minutes longer. So they gained about 45, 50 minutes extra sleep a night. Middle school was similar in that they went to bed 8 minutes later, and they slept 40 minutes longer. So for each of those two age groups, they saw an increase in sleep per night. The other thing that was interesting when you heard from them was that the students reported they were more ready for school when they went, and they didn't need to do catch-up sleep on the weekends. If you have high school students right now, many of them will talk about the fact that they sleep until 10 or 10:30 or 11. There's some catch-up sleep going on because they're getting behind on sleep potentially during the week. So that's an interesting, that's one school or one school district. That's not everybody, but that's not everybody collects data as directly as Cherry Creek did. So that feels like for me, I guess it was certainly interesting to hear that's what they were seeing.
That sounds good. I also want to commend the audience on your penmanship and your succinct questions. I want to say that we've had 3 of these. You guys are at the top of the group so far. All right. Matt, this one's for you. You look like you're ready to answer a question, so I want to help you out. Do all proposed scenarios eliminate the current combined middle school, high school busing?
I believe all but, 2 of the scenarios do eliminate the combined busing that we see at this location and Preston. There still will be some combined busing around the district, but it does eliminate. I'm not sure which scenarios. I'd have to go back through and look, so I apologize for that. But yes, we do have some elimination of that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Also, there was a question just out of interest. How many bus drivers PSD employs?
Bus drivers, we employ, the whole department is our bus drivers, so there's 210 people in the department. As far as specifically, that's their job duty, about 178.
Okay, thank you very much. Pete, this one's for you. Maybe a combo question for you, both you and Scott, on day-to-day operations. Can high school lunch times be shorter to allow for an earlier release time?
I think right now with 3 of the high schools with a single lunch and one with, depending on the day, and I don't know exactly, Scott might for Fort Collins High. I know it's kind of a split schedule for lunch. I think that shortening the time, whether students leave campus or eat on campus or choose to stay, I think checking with the high school principals might challenge that, because at this point when you're doing a single lunch and you're running whatever the percentage, let's say we have 30% give or take participation in our high school lunch, and that's give or take where we're at. That's a lot of students to run through in a shortened period of time. So I think it would be a challenge. It could be something to be looked at, but I don't know if you gain enough meaningful minutes at this point, but good question.
The other things you bump into, and this is one of those challenges, is putting together the transportation plan in each of the scenarios, and every one we ran is like a puzzle. And so when you look at the end times, yes, there's a possibility of moving them back, and you heard me talk about with scenario B, it's possible as we look at it that there's space between when the buses that are picking up at the high school are running and what they ran before that, in which case you could bring those back forward possibly. But if the schedule is such that there's no space before those buses run at the high school, there's no way to bring that end time back. And I'm assuming that question has more to do with the end time than it does the start time. I may be being presumptuous there, but that's my assumption, is to move the lunchtime would be to end school earlier rather than start it later.
You notice, Scott, the last couple of times we've had these sessions, we've had high school students here. They're really interested. So a question becomes, how have we gotten input from our students? Have we received input from our students? And then once all that input's done, the survey closes. Survey closes October 1. When the survey closes, are we going to report those results? So the first question is kind of a two-parter. How are we getting feedback from our students? And then are we going to report what our students said? In other words, are we going to break that data apart and those results apart to share information based on groups?
Yeah, there's a couple things we're doing. One, first of all, high school students, you are invited to take the survey just like the adults. And you'll be able to tell us you're a student in there. So that's critically important, that you get on and take the survey, just like I hope parents, you all do the same. So that's one of the ways that we open it up. And in that scenario, we open it up to 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders to find out what they felt like about the scenarios that we've proposed. The other thing we're attempting to do is to move around and work with focus groups at each of the high schools. I actually was out at Fort Collins High School yesterday and had a chance to work with a focus group there and get some pretty candid feedback about the scenarios. I was interested, I guess the focus I would say for them was more around end times than it was anything else. They were all in favor of starting later, but they weren't super jazzed about ending later. So they liked the idea of starting later and ending earlier, was what they liked.
You were shocked by that?
Not really.
All right. Pete, this will be for you and Matt. There's a question, do you anticipate a later start time for high school will affect the traffic patterns in surrounding neighborhoods? Currently, leaving neighborhoods south of Fossil Ridge High School between 7 and 7:30 is quite challenging.
Yeah, we just had that conversation last week with the Fossil Ridge administration as we were watching some of the traffic come down Ziegler and get into Sabercat. So it's good timing for that question. And, part of the answer is yes. I think it'll take and spread out some of that initial start time. It might get closer to the start time if we, right now you have Fossil Ridge, Kennard, and Zach. If we flip that and a lot of the traffic on Ziegler gets pushed to a later start time, it might mitigate some of that traffic that those of you that drive this area know how congested that does get. So city traffic operations were with us at that time, and they felt like that could create a little bit more of a gap for specifically in this area.
Very good. Interesting question. Again, you guys are great at the questions. You get the best one so far. I'm not sure who would be the best to answer this one. Pete, it might be you for facility use, but the question is, will private music teachers, and I'm going to assume that could also include private tutoring types of things our students engage in after school. The question is, will private music teachers be given access to school facilities for lessons since after school available lesson time will be shorter? The travel time makes before school lessons not very feasible. So the real question is, are we going to open up our ideas about access to the buildings to help accommodate the kids for those times?
Yeah, that's another great question. I agree. Right now with our facility use at the secondaries generally starts around 6 o'clock and after, and we open it up to such scenarios as Todd mentioned with private use, even whether it's a private use by a citizen or a private use by a teacher, we open it up at that point in time. So right now with some of the scenarios, it does, at face value, point to opening that community use schedule up later into the evening, could be 7 o'clock or whatnot, which is not, I believe, that advantageous to a lot of people. So we could take a look at that, have not really run that, I guess that scenario through, but I know the committee talked about that too, as not only music lessons, but Parks and Rec, adult basketball leagues, any type of community use after school gets out, especially at the secondary level, could be compromised.
Very good. How about some comments? Some of you have written some comments. We've been hitting on the questions. I'm going to read a few of these. This is a comment from one of the audience members. No need to reply here, but despite the increased cost to the system with a late start time, the negative cost to our students is immeasurable. If the current time scenarios is maintained, the negative cost to our students is immeasurable if the current start times and scenarios are maintained. It is too high. The cost is too high. Another comment, thank you so much for addressing this very important issue. This is a big challenge, and I appreciate the district's willingness to take this on. So that's a big thank you for all of you and along with the other people who are doing this work. Another comment, we are in support of the later start time. It would be great and helpful to have links to research from large schools who have successfully changed their start times. You've heard us mention Cherry Creek. There's also a reference on here to Fairfax County, Virginia. We have some of those links, so a comment there to be able to see how they're doing that. Here's another comment. Since the first PSD survey clearly said that all grade levels parents would like school to start between 8 a.m. and 8:30 a.m., I would like to see the district develop an option, cost, times, routes, that will reflect this parent input. Let's not say this is impossible or a scenario that is eliminated. Scott, I want to jump back to maybe one of the slides you had. The comment on here was 8 and 8:30. That is what most of our parents said. Does that line up with where you are right there?
Yeah. It does. And Matt, we tried several scenarios. I don't remember the cost, but when we collapse all those, I think there's multiple, and I appreciate the question. I don't live in a world that much is impossible. I like problem solving. And I also recognize that when we start looking at condensing our start times, you have smaller geographical areas where they were able to get their start times closer together, but it's hard to get all your buses running at the same time. And I think you go back to a question that Pete answered just a little bit ago. And if we had I just use Preston, Fossil, Kennard, and Zach, because I know that area pretty well. If you had all 4 of those schools starting between 8 and 8:30, it'd be a pickle because there's not a lot of ability to get into those 4 schools in separate ways and then get out of them in separate ways. And so and they're spread out right now relatively well, and you still, if you drive in here, you still know there's quite a bit of traffic going on, whether it's Zach's start time or Kennard's start time or Preston's start time or Fossil's. A school starting in this neighborhood. And so I just think about that's setting aside the monetary value, and we've got other neighborhoods like this. I just happen to know this one better than the others. And so, but I appreciate how do we continue to look at what might be opportunities for success.
Scott, I'm going to stay with you, and then Dave, I got one coming to you your way. I don't want you to get too bored down there on the end. We're going to get you in just a moment. Scott, I'm going to shift over to athletics. And one of the questions that comes up on 3 or 4 of the cards that have been handed in has to do with before school practices, knowing that you mentioned a little bit earlier those practices could go an hour later into the evening. Will our athletic teams have the option of running their practices before school?
Once again, I would say that's a decision we haven't made. I think it's somewhat dependent upon what the what schedule we choose, but we have stuff that's going on before our current start time. We have 0 hour going on in many locations right now, particularly for music. And we have some athletic events that happen before school in our current schedule. I think the recommendation would likely be that we look to enhance the opportunities for students in 0 hour, both from an athletic standpoint, potentially a clubs and activities standpoint, and also some classes. And I would cite and say, if you just think about the flexibility of a 9 o'clock start, for instance, this is just an option. You could have a 0 hour that started about 8 o'clock that is an option for students. It's one they select into, so it's not going to be all your students, and it's still a half hour later than our students are coming to school now. One of the things I heard yesterday as I was talking to the focus group at Fort Collins High was a couple football players are part of that, and they have several hours of football a night at Fort Collins High School, but some of it is film study and lifting. And they got pretty jazzed about the fact that film study and lifting could happen before school, and the actual dressing out and physical part of football could happen after school. And they thought that might be a positive for them, rather than trying to do all of that between the end of school and going home for dinner, which is the way it's going on right now. They're doing all that in one lump practice. And so they got pretty excited. That wasn't something I'd even thought about. I hadn't even thought about taking your practice and separating it into two different spots. So there's some flexibility in the schedule. And again, as I started to talk about, flexibility will be positive for some and negative for others.
Let's go to the other end of the day. One of the questions came up, if school goes later in and kids have to take off and meet an earlier time, is it possible they're going to miss more school, or athletes are going to miss more school at the end of the day on average than they currently do when they make those road trips?
Yeah, it's certainly possible. It would be hard for me to say it's not possible and likely realistic that students could miss a little bit more at the end of the day than they do today. We won't be able to control everything, and if you can't control everything, you got to make the assumption we'll miss a little more time.
Dave, one of the questions that came up, Scott did a nice job presenting the information that people had gathered regarding the cost of routes, drivers, all those kinds of things. So we see the fees are the costs that are associated with the driving. Have we looked at any other costs that may be associated with this late start that we haven't shown up here and we haven't commented on?
Sure, yeah. There has not been an all-inclusive look at all costs. I believe what we were trying to do is focus on what we thought the primary costs were, which were obviously transportation, moving routes around. But, Director Hall had mentioned utilities being something we need to look a little closer to. We would also need to look at the support staff for these buildings because they may be starting at different times, things like that. But we believe that the primary driver of cost is the transportation costs that we've identified.
Okay, thank you very much. This one's going to be a question, but has a comment on the front end of it. I'm going to let that slide because it's a pretty good one. All right, my children will need to work for their college education. If the start-end times are later, this will significantly reduce their opportunities. Will there be any online options, summer school, or other opportunities available so they can still work, or could they even be released early?
There's a lot of good options in that.
Yeah, that's some good stuff. That's why I read that one.
Or question, whichever part of that was. I think the answer to all of those would be yes, there is currently today options, however limited in online, or I would say a blended version. There's some going on in this building right now. The 0 hour becomes an opportunity. There certainly is some release period that happens in this school and others across the system. I wonder about possibly a more systemic approach to both 0 hour and after school, and how much control we have over that. But I think there certainly is lots of possibility. There's summer school and the summer school options looking at increasing. And so I think lots of options to think about how might you mitigate a later end time so that students have capacity. The other thing is looking at how might the jobs they're doing connect to some of the classes that they're studying, or we get them into opportunities we're trying to increase across the district, whether it's internships or apprenticeships. And so might that be a way to help with some of that as well. But there are lots of great options in that question that could help mitigate a 4 o'clock end time or a 4:15 end time.
Matt, I'm going to come back to you here for just a moment. Have you considered eliminating buses or routes to accommodate both a middle and high school late start, but not so late as 9 a.m.? Let me read that again. I'm going to try to come through this. Have you considered eliminating buses or routes to accommodate both a middle school and high school late start, but not so late as 9 a.m.?
You're going to have to read that again. I'm not sure what the question is.
I'm going to come back to that.
I mean, we've got scenarios that start
well, I
at
think
8:30 and 8:45.
It comes back down. There's a comment after, and it says there are larger urban areas that do not have any bus services. Perhaps reduce the bus service radius to make changing start times easier and more economical.
Well, to address that, if we go back to the slides, we live in a rather large district here. We compare ourselves to Cherry Creek, which has more student population, but then their district is really small. I think they're like 150 square miles maybe, and we're 1,900 square miles. Although we don't service the whole 1,900, we do serve a large majority of that. Our district runs all the way to Wyoming. We have buses that go all the way out to Carr. I think we're addressing some of those needs to shorten those bus rides and shorten those bus areas with some of the new schools that are coming online in a few years. But right now, no, there's really not any intention to cut any busing in that matter. I think we do have a couple scenarios that do address the times before 9 o'clock as well as we could. Back to the 8 to 8:30 times. Those scenarios were looked at, run extensively, because it did look like, maybe we could blend some of those times with the elementaries and get the middle schools and the high schools more aligned. One of the scenarios that we ran actually added about 26 drivers to the system. I can tell you right now, we're already short drivers, and to find 26 more, we could buy buses all day long, but we probably wouldn't find people to put in those buses, and that would be a real issue for parents and families then, because they're expecting this bus to show up, but we really don't have any way of making that bus move at that point. So those kind of scenarios were looked at, and that was the reason that we didn't present them. It had a lot of logistical issues to them like that. I hope I answered that question.
I think you did. Definitely you did. One of the questions that came up, have we noticed a decrease in performance? And in particular, the question has to do with, have we noticed a decrease in park scores, performance indicators, other areas that indicate student performance due to start times? And I think that's a difficult one, because right now we only know the one start times we're dealing with, and we know what our student performance is. Regarding we haven't gone to a different start time, so we don't know what that impact will be, but I'll project that over and talk a little bit briefly about maybe what some of our other districts have found. And actually, I won't talk about that. Scott, I might turn that one to you. I know you've had some conversations with employees or personnel in other districts. How's that affecting them, if anything, so far?
So I'll say in general, when you look at the studies, they talk about the achievement increasing. But one of the things I would say, and I'll cite Cherry Creek, and we had Cherry Creek who presented at the Colorado Conference earlier this summer. And they've only been doing their late start for a year, so they don't have I haven't seen the academic performance for them. But what they were able to talk about was, I talked already about the increased sleep, but they also talked at great length about the mental health improvements that they saw in year one. And that was striking to me, because we talk about mental health a lot in this district and how we can impact the mental health, the readiness our students have to take on life as a high schooler. And so they talked about, as they talked about some of their mental health changes, they saw a decrease in feeling nervous of 6%, a 9% decrease in feeling worried, a 9% decrease in reporting drowsy driving at least once in a week, 12% increase in readiness to start the school day. When you start thinking about those, you could predict that they're going to see an increase in achievement. But as you think about mental health, if the achievement was exactly the same, and mental health of the students going through, Cherry Creek, I would suspect, will say it was a home run for them. I think the other thing that was interesting for them, as they talked about it, was that their middle school students reported feeling less rushed and less morning conflict. Their elementary students reported being more energetic and having more time to play outside outside the school day. And the high school students, their statement that they reported on their presentation was they said it was life-changing. And so that was fascinating to me. That's not what I expected they'd see that soon. I also would qualify it by saying it's one school district in 1 year. So take that for what it's worth. It's not a long-term study, but it certainly is some information and some data that they've been able to collect because they've been working with an outside entity to help them study both pre and post where their kids are at.
Okay, this will be a question. I'll stay with you, Scott. There are currently a lot of school out days we're out of the buildings for whatever reason. Any thought to eliminating these in order to let school out earlier each day?
And that's a hard one because I think when you look at the system, it feels like it as a parent, it feels like there are a lot. When you feel like it, when you're working in a school or running a school, there's not enough. There's not enough time to do the work that you do to make sure you're prepared for the students or prepared to give feedback to the parents about the students that you're working with. I would say it would be hard to make the time that teachers have to work to prepare less, but we have not had dialogue around that at this point.
Okay, a couple of them about habits at home. Are you concerned about increased truancy or absenteeism in high school students if parents have to leave for work before they need to get up for school? So parents getting out of the house, haven't quite got the teenager up. Are we worried about the impact of that on attendance or truancy?
You know, it is a worry. I won't say a worry, it's a wondering. But one of the things I'll tell you is that when you look at like the medical research, they would tell you that truancy decreases, that attendance increases, and that students feel more engaged in school. If you're feeling less, if you just think about what Cherry Creek said, if you're feeling less worried about school and you're experiencing more success as you're ready more for it, you're not likely to say, I don't want to go. When students make the decision to be truant, there's usually some behavior, some meaning behind that behavior. And if you're helping kids to be in a healthier state of mind, you're likely that they'll be more engaged in participating in school. But that's what research is saying. I didn't see in Cherry Creek's data specific information about their truancy rates for last year, but as we see the report they're working on, hopefully that'll be part of what they present. PSD's main argument is about sleep studies. Is it not reasonable to assume that the later kids start their homework and activities, then the later they will also go to bed? I think it's reasonable to assume that. I think it's not what research, and I hear the question that we're looking at research. I think that's a good way to do whatever you do, whether we're talking about curriculum we're looking at in a school or whether we're looking at making a start time, that we look at what other entities have found in doing this kind of work before. But there's no question that it's early in transition, right? I talked about 70, 80% of the schools across the country stay at the high schools with the earliest start time, so you can't collect any information from those schools. But the medical journals, the medical research, and the school districts that we have had a chance to hear from talk about the fact that the students do their work and are able to go to sleep when their body's ready to go to sleep and sleep in. Again, when I was talking to the students yesterday, one of the things they talked about was you have the ability to wake up refreshed, and you may have some time to do a little homework in the morning. And that you're able to sleep when your body tells you to sleep. And right now, I suspect, and maybe even in the group tonight, that there's a challenge as your kids are still trying to figure out both the homework and getting to sleep, and then their bodies are going to sleep at midnight or 12:30, yesterday the kid said about 12:30 or 1 o'clock. And then at Fort Collins High School, 3 days a week, they're starting at 7:30 in the morning. So they're getting on the bus at 6:15 or 6:30 in the morning, or maybe 6:45 in the morning. So there's not a lot of sleep time in there either. So it's a challenge. I would go back, I think, to the question earlier about homework and the quantity of homework and how that all fits. It all fits together, but the research is pointing to sleep is a great equalizer for students, that they're more equipped to handle whether you're talking homework or whether you're talking the things that fly at them in the school when they have enough sleep. And if that's early and early, or if that's late and late, each student is a little different. Keep in mind what the research is telling us is that adolescent, their sleep patterns slide a little bit later for a few years and then move back. And I don't know, I have a junior and a fifth grader, and I can tell you I certainly see the differences in my house.
Yeah, that's for sure. You mentioned about homework in the morning. I watched my daughter, junior in high school, doing her chemistry homework this morning about 6:15. Just decided sleep was more important at the end, and she got up a little earlier. Dave, this one's for you. Straightforward question. Is this a permanent change or just a trial?
Well, I believe that if we were to move forward with that would be considered a permanent change. You know, it would be quite an endeavor to do that, to try it, and then to reverse it. I think we'd want to look at it and be sure that that's the direction we're going.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a question, I'll take this one. How does PSD plan to gauge impact on less involved parents that maybe didn't respond to the survey or come to the community engagement? I will tell you, I think we do a really good job of reaching out in a multitude of ways. We've put that survey out, we've put the link out for a reminder. We continue to remind our families. We have 4 engagement sessions. We made sure those were each at the feeder high schools so we could try to geographically give some people some shorter distances to travel. I think outside of that, we're gonna have to go with what we have for those that participated. For those that aren't quite as involved, we're not really sure how to reach them, but we'll continue to find a multitude of modes and ways to reach out, and we'll always do that as we wrap this up. I want to let you know, I know I see Deb over here, she's getting ready to hand me a couple more cards. I'm down to 2. I consolidated some of that. I just want to do kind of a last call for note cards and index cards if you have any questions, and then we're going to go with these. Scott, one of the questions that gets referred to in here is block days. I know that we have block scheduling at Rocky Mountain High School, so I'll lump this into one general question. Do we have current configurations in the way we deliver instruction on blocks and days and times that are going to be affected by that? Are schools still going to be able to do those same things?
Yeah, I mean, essentially their schedules could look identical to what they do now, with the exception if we moved to one of the A, B, or C and lost the late start, they're going to have to figure out where those late start minutes land. You're going to end up taking some late start minutes from the long days and making the shorter day a little longer. But yes, they'll still be able to run the block schedule like they run it now. In many respects, we're taking what they have, picking it up, moving it over, and dropping it back down. So Rocky could do their block the way they do it, and Fossil could do their schedule much the same as they do it now. They'll have to be a little creative because of the loss of the late start as they know it now, but yes, the way they're running it could be pretty consistent.
Okay, thank you. Last question. Matt, this one's for you. What is the average bus ride time for elementary, middle, and high school students? Are they significantly different?
Not significantly different, but yeah, there are definitely differences. Our high schoolers, currently right now, we have students that get on as early as 6 a.m. in the morning up in the mountain areas, and very long bus rides to get to Poudre High School, where they'll change buses up to 3 times actually to get there. So those routes are always difficult for those families and students. Elementaries are a little shorter up there, of course, because we have elementary schools in place. I would say right now our elementary students have our shortest rides, and then you could just follow that on down. Our middle school and high school would probably have comparable rides together. Average ride time is around 45 minutes to 50 minutes. And then some of the shorter ride times could be as less as 20 minutes, and then we do have some routes that will actually run up to an hour and a half.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder, we are going to do one more community engagement session. That's going to take place at Rocky Mountain High School next Thursday, 6 o'clock start time instead of 5:30. We encourage you, if you still have questions that you have or just want to hear what your community members have to say about this. Also, don't forget survey information, and we will respond and publish answers to questions that come along. We want to keep our community informed. We know some of them can't make these events, but they're deeply interested in this topic. We want to continue to fill their bucket with information. Again, survey closes October 1st. We're all together again one more time next Thursday. I also want to thank Mr. Dave Montoya, Mr. Pete Hall, Mr. Matt Bryant, Mr. Scott Nielsen for their work and their preparation tonight. We really appreciate that, along with Phil on the board, Lauren, Deb. Thank you for all you have there. Without any more index cards in my hand, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to tell the group next week at Rocky, and I tell the other groups, these were the best questions so far, so they have to step up to the bar for the thoughtfulness you put into this. We really appreciate you being here tonight. Have a safe evening. Thank you.